Okay, so just to get started here, there is a link here to a video that I think does a nice job here of explaining sort of the Canada's entry into the war and what the reaction was of soldiers that fought in the trenches for the first time. And this is a great little video that comes from the National Film Board that actually is taken from soldiers' letters, diary entries, and those sorts of things. So this might spur on some ideas as far as your trench warfare assignment. So I would encourage you to watch this video. I think that you will find it beneficial. All right, when we begin our look at trench warfare, we have to talk about the actual physical construction of the trenches itself. And you can see here that this is an artistic rendering here, and we will look at some real images. But I think this is does a great job here of giving us a sense of what the trench design was. And as you can see here, there are so imagine this trench line here. This is like a cross section. So the trenches themselves actually spanned about 500 kilometers. They went all the way from the English Channel in the north, way down into the mountains in the Alps in the south. So it had to be continuous because there couldn't be any open spots or breaks in the line. Otherwise, the enemies here would have just sort of poured through there, and the war would have been over. So this is highly complex and highly sophisticated, even though it's kind of primitive in its actual construction. So we can see the three lines here. We call this the front line, and this, of course, would be the most deadly section of the trench here, because that's where the combat essentially would happen. All right. Now, the second row here was called the supporting trench. The support trench was essentially that. It was designed to provide support to the front line through these communication trenches, they called these. So if for some reason there was a pitched attack here, right, and there was heavy fire, or a lot of pressure coming on a section of the front line, then men could be called from the reserve here to come to the front line here to help fortify that and beef it up so that it doesn't fall to the enemy. So the support line here, it was a little more relaxed because they were not necessarily on duty all the time. Although soldiers had regular duties throughout the day, it was actually the day itself was quite mundane. It was kind of boring for soldiers, and they were long because they went through the same. So it's military, right? So there was very regimented sort of exercises and practices they had to do every day. Now down here in the second or the supporting trench, you can see they had these deep dugouts, they called them, and they were essentially that. They were big sort of cavernous rooms that were dug well underground, and they would provide the men some safety from artillery fire and that sort of thing. But there was kind of undesirable down here, but relative safety here from any sort of aerial bombardment. In the front line, they had dugouts, and they were oftentimes just dug out into the back wall. It was kind of like a shelf, and men could sit in these dugouts here. That's where they slept. That's where they would eat. It would give them an opportunity to get their feet up off the ground, especially if they had to change their boots if it was wet. The dugout was very primitive, but it provided a little bit of shelter. Now, all the way back here in the third line here had the reserve trench. And the reserve trench was essentially that. It was where reserves, ammunition, tools, equipment, those sorts of things would have been stored in the reserve trench. And that material and equipment was all used here to arm the men, to rebuild sections of the trench that maybe were falling apart or were whatever they were damaged from artillery fire, etc. And then well in behind the lines, we had here the artillery. All right, and you could see that the artillery would have been so far back that it wouldn't have actually even been able to see the trenches themselves, right? Roughly 10 kilometers away. But these cannons could fire all the way over here and across this section, which was called no man's land. And essentially, no man's land was the area between the two opposing trenches here. The Germans would have had a similar trench design of their own on this side. Okay, and up above here we would have aerial reconnaissance. So this would have been some primitive planes that would have been flown for the first time in World War I. The air warfare we'll talk about in another element here, but it was relatively primitive, primarily used just for scouting purposes or reconnaissance, gaining information about the enemy. All right, so I'll pause it here.